hopefully that made sense. Maybe it made sense, but it wasn't clear why it mattered. So let's kind of address that a little bit right now. We just came off of the episode of Thy Strong Word with our guest, Pastor Thomas Eckstein from Concordia Jamestown. So check that out if you haven't already. We'll get that posted on the podcast soon. Thanks for the questions that came in here on Facebook here from Paul and David. Good questions. I always tell people, if you're not trying to picture what's going on when you're reading the Bible and you're not asking questions, you're not reading it right. You've got to be trying to wrap your arms around the thing, just at the very least so that you can touch it, right? We're not going to quite get it. So looking at this here. So, in 24, we saw there's actually a very good and natural way of making sense of all the motion. And I guess I should just fess up now. So when I was an undergrad, I did my senior thesis on biblical motion verbs. It was in Greek, but I'm kind of equally fascinated with Hebrew. So motion verbs are my thing. Not because it was just probably just a part of it that I just like imagining the story and kind of the movie, how it goes, right? But in terms of what we get as Christians out of this, it's important because when you're looking at the motion, it's telling you where the scene is and what's the center of the scene and who's at the center of the scene. And then that tells you then what's important. What's the point of this scene, right? When you can say, well, this is where this scene took place, or this is where this scene took place, or this is where someone was going to or from, that's kind of telling you hang on, what's the takeaway? See, so motion verbs end up being, I think, really important for interpretation. So we saw in chapter 24, it begins with this kind of pluperfect aside. Don't be scared of me saying pluperfect. I just mean it really is not and then he said, but rather now he had said to Moses, right? Just as kind of okay, pause. We're gonna give you a little refresher, right? So and that explains then why Moses goes down the mountain to bring everybody up, right? Because otherwise, it would kind of jar the narrative a little bit. Because in chapter 23, God's telling him good stuff, right? You shall make no covenant with them and their gods and all this stuff, right? And then later, he's gonna go up the mountain. In verse where is it? In chapter 25. And then he's going to start talking about the directions for the sanctuary. That is to say, not quite the temple yet, but the tabernacle. So otherwise, if it weren't for this little detour, you might just think to yourself, well, why didn't Moses just stay up there and get all of it? Well, it's so that he could go down, have the ratification with the people, which included taking Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders who represent Israel. I think I mentioned this back in, it was Exodus 13 or something like that, that the old tradition is that 70 was also a number that represents the people of God, because it represented not the 12 tribes, but the 70 clans. Okay, so the idea is that all of the clans of Israel are going up onto the mountain and ratifying this treaty, this covenant with God. Not every single person, but one of the chief. It says chief men in verse 24. It's kind of like clan chieftains or something like that. Okay, so there you have it. Then it's this little segue. Okay, so Moses comes down. So the perspective is actually from the people, right? Which again I think complements what we were saying. That the emphasis is not God's up there looking down at them being like, guys, you think you can do this, but no, it is a moment of grace. They come down and you see Moses, right? It's saying, put yourself in their shoes. You see Moses coming down the mountain and you're like, oh my God, literally, Moses, you're back. so what's going to happen next? What's up? And then he tells you. He goes and tells you everything, and it's a moment of grace. So it's celebrated here. So I think that's the importance there. That this is a beautiful thing. This moment of the ratification of the treaty, putting the blood on them, right? It's a good thing, right? I mean, this is so different later from when the crowds are shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." May his blood be on us and on our children. In a negative sense, right? Like his blood is on their hands. That's a really negative moment. Like, no, this is a really positive one. This is one that's foreshadowing the sacraments. When God's like putting his blood on us, the blood of his son Jesus that atones and forgives us. So, good moment here. And then we have the condensed narrative there in verses. What was it, 10 and 11? No, 9 and 10, right? And 9 and 10, there's our condensed narrative. And then 11, like I was saying, is a little bit of a kind of summary, like, hey, look, they were all able to behold God and live to tell the tale. And in fact, if you look carefully at that, it's a little bit more in verse 11. It kind of what's the best way to put this here? There's a topic shift where actually the first words of verse 11 are, "As for the chief men of the sons of Israel," right? So it goes and shifts to that, and actually the next verb you get is actually another pluperfect. They had. So what's it say here? God had not put his hand on them. So then the idea is such that they could go ahead and eat and drink. So God basically let them come. A little bit of like let the little children come to me kind of thing. So those verbs are kind of like in this little summary saying like they were able to go up the mountain and eat and drink. But that kind of implies, which complements verse 12, that they're back down at this point. Like they're actually maybe even just telling people, this is what happened. And God didn't stop us. He didn't say, stand back, only Moses can come to me, right? So 24 is actually, I think, kind of locked up. It's kind of simple. Relatively how to interpret this and get the story, get the movie right in your head. So okay, let's go back to 19 now. Okay, so what on earth was going on in 19? And particularly here, what was going on when it came to the Ten Commandments, okay? So appreciating this now, this is one of the moments, honestly, I mean, no translation is perfect, but Luther's advice is spot on. It's better just to stick with one translation despite all its faults and just be consistent. Hopping around between translations just messes it up because you're going to have an impossible time trying to like actually be able to memorize things or become really familiar with the stories. So I will admit that the NIV is just straight up better on chapter 19, but it's not better in every respect. So what the NIV does make a little bit clearer though is so you've got this situation here. They encamped, it says here in verse 2, they encamped before the mountain. So the idea is they're not on the mountain. They're not even at the base of the mountain. They're just kind of like in the vicinity of the mountain, right? Okay, so that's important. In verse 7 then, our next little comment, just kind of like getting to have a sense of like where are people moving around here. It says, so Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All right, so it's in that moment that you get a little bit of this already, like, okay, Moses has gone up. He went up in verse 3. He went up the mountain. He didn't go all the way up the mountain quite yet. He goes back down. And he calls the people, right? And so they kind of like come out of their tents and it's like, okay, listen, this is the plan. And what's he say in the plan, right? Well, the plan that he tells them. And see, this is you got to try to hang with this, because this actually takes out the contradiction when you read this carefully. Because if you and actually, it might be useful to check it out. If you guys ever look at like one of the more like critical commentaries that are like put out there, like what's a commentary that like is a good one, that would be kind of a more critical perspective here. So like on Exodus, for example, here, you could look at, well, actually, even the NIV, there's an NIV application series, which I think is actually like a really good series. It actually has a nice balance between scholarship and kind of just practical, like devotional kinds of stuff. It's got like, even like anecdotes and stories like from like just Christians who are trying to like, live this out. But it will get into some of the critical scholarship stuff. But if you want like a real, like really getting into that stuff, Dozeman is the name, Doze. I know you're like, oh, we don't want to snooze through that. Dozeman, Thomas B. Dozeman. No, it's actually a fantastic commentary, but it's very much in that critical school. And so he will tell you like, yeah, this is because it doesn't make any sense because, one guy was in here, then the other guy just starts editing it, and it didn't really make sense in the end. I think if you pay close enough attention to the Hebrew grammar, you don't need to actually come up with that conclusion. So what's the plan? The plan then, in verse 9, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear, this is key, when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever, right? So the idea is that God's going to come down, and he's going to be on the top of the mountain, and he's going to start thundering down this stuff from the top of the mountain, so that Moses and the people will hear it. But will they be close enough to actually make out these thunderous words? No, they won't. They're going to need Moses, which is kind of, I think, implied even in verse 9 when it says, so that they may believe you forever. I think the idea is Moses is going to go and speak these words then as the interpreter of the divine thunder voice. And the people are going to say to themselves, like, oh, okay, he's not just making this stuff up. We couldn't exactly make out what God said, but, that was definitely God speaking before Moses spoke. So, yeah, I think we're making the connection. So nothing really explicit that really gets this until a little bit later in chapter 19. And this is, I think, maybe the critical mistake of many interpreters here. When you go down here, you get, let me see here. It's, I love verse 16 though, right? It says there, like on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain. I mean, it's a pre-resurrection moment, right? The morning of the third day, God shows up, it's, so anyway, so there's that. And then of course, also, I mean, just think about that too, this trumpet, right? I mean, what does Paul talk about with the second coming at the resurrection of all flesh, right? The trumpet will sound, right? Where is he getting it? Exodus. So really cool to see like Exodus 19 lined up with the resurrection accounts of the gospel, and then Revelation and in Paul's writings about the resurrection of all flesh. So yeah, so but that aside though, so verse 16 and then 17, so the people that come out of their tents again, right? And it says they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. So again, they do not go onto the mountain. And in fact, the instructions all along, despite the ESV's renderings, like for instance, where was like one of the renderings here, it was kind of weird. Where was it here? Oh yeah, take care not to. This is in verse 12, right? Take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. No. It means approach the mountain. And if you look at the NIV, that's actually what it has. That's correct. And so back earlier, the same kind of thing. I think it's trying to find. It is one other spot where it has the same language, and the word just actually means like go up to, is the idea. Like I'm not going to get into like the breaking down the Hebrew prepositions and stuff like that. But the idea is they're not supposed to approach the mountain until a certain point. And so now they approach the mountain actually as they have been instructed to do. So there's no contradiction there. Let's see here. Am I getting a comment here on Facebook? I'm just going to go ahead and check that really quick. Make sure everyone's following along. If anyone's hanging on live. Okay, no. Good. Everyone's just going to get this after the fact. But yeah, so they go, right, and they're going to approach the mountain at the right time. So when that trumpet blasts in verse 16, he brings the people out in 17. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. That's what they're supposed to do. They're not on the mountain. But the thing is, Moses actually does go up the mountain, and he doesn't go all the way up because he's standing in this intermediate position now where he's going to be able to have this going back and forth thing between the people who are scared and not supposed to go up onto the mountain and God who's up there at the top. So you get this then in verse 19, and this is the part where there's like, oh man, there's so much like that's been written about the Hebrew grammar in verse 19. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. I mean, the translation is really ambiguous and vague here. The idea is like the trumpet. It's like this is what happened when the trumpet got really loud, basically. So the trumpet gets really loud, which it signals that, okay, God has arrived. And this is then the key in the Hebrew in verse 19. It actually says, and then Moses, or it says rather, Moses would speak, and then God would answer him in thunder. That is to say that the verbs unambiguously mean there's a back and forth. And in fact, you can, if you're really, really nerdy, you can look this up, and like any of the authoritative Hebrew scholars will tell you this. Like these forms are actually ones that you can't mistake because they're suffixed this certain way. So it's not like a toss-up like, well, maybe it means this or maybe it means that. Like, well, no, not in this case. It actually means, Moses would say some things and God would answer him. So there's a back and forth going on. And that, I think, is one of the things that made a lot of sense for me then, that is that really like makes sense of this here. So so there's this back and forth going on between God and Moses. It says there in verse 20, so then God comes down on Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. So he makes his voice is kind of already up there, but now there's this kind of visible manifestation. He calls to Moses. Moses goes up. Verse 21, go down, warn the people, right? So this is good. They're not going to go up the mountain. They're not supposed to, right? And I think actually then this is another little thing here. People are like, now hang on a second. If God's saying now he doesn't want the people on the mountain, then why is Moses like kind of like arguing with him in verse 23, right? In verse 23 there, it says, Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us. As if God is like forgetting what he just said. You look at the verb there. This is a really interesting verb for cannot. One of the translations that you can look it up in your standard Hebrew Aramaic lexicon is you cannot bring yourself to, right? So what's going on is Moses is just emphatically agreeing with God, not arguing with him. So God's saying, okay, I told them to come near the mountain. That's good, Moses, but you better go back down there and warn them not to get any closer. And what's Moses saying? Oh God, we will certainly obey your command. There's no way they're going to come up the mountain because, well, God, they can't bring themselves to, because they're full of fear of you, because you yourself warned us to put limits around the mountain, right? Which is to say that actually, again, the fear is a good thing. Like God wants some fear in his children, not terror, not panic, but good godly fear. So Moses is not arguing with God. He's saying, no, surely God, they will not go up. All right, I'm going to make sure they don't. Of course, I will relay the message, but they're not going to. They're scared and full of holy fear. They wouldn't dare do such a thing. So Moses then gets a little bit more instruction here in verse 24. The Lord said to him, "Go down, come up, bringing Aaron with you," reiterating, nobody else, right? And then you get this moment where this is where all the commentary, man, like every commentary says that the Bible is messed up here. Like this is just some kind of fragment. Something's been lost. It doesn't make any sense. It makes sense, guys. It does. So what happens is that Moses goes down now. He gets Aaron, his brother, the priest. They go up to that intermediate spot where they can stand between God, who's up on the summit, and the people who are not on the mountain, but standing at the foot. They're in this intermediate spot. And then it says in verse 25, in the Hebrew, it says, and this is significant too. So it says, how can I? So it says he went. So it says he went down to the people, right? Like to like the intermediate spot, right? And then he said to them. And the natural way to take it is what comes next is the thing that's coming out of Moses' mouth, which everyone's like, but now hang on a second. That's weird because verse 20 says, and then God said all this. So who's talking? Both of them. Again, we already saw in chapter 19 that there is this back and forth, right? There's this back and forth thing going on. So what you have here, if I were to kind of give you a translation that kind of captures what's going on in the Hebrew, it's something like, so Moses went down and said to the people, and God spoke these very words here, I am the Lord your God. Right, so the idea is that this, actually the very next thing in verse 1 of chapter 20 is actually a little bit of a parenthesis that's saying these are the actual words of God himself. It wasn't just Moses speaking these words. God was speaking them too. And probably it would have mirrored what we had in chapter 19, where Moses spoke, God answered in thunder. Probably here, God spoke in thunder, and then Moses spoke. I mean, or potentially, right, Moses would say the thing, and then God would, like, confirm it in thunder. I guess I'm not totally sure on that. Be interesting to get someone else's take on that. But that's basically what you have going on here. And then we get into, like what we talked about the other day, about how really the key for understanding how you number these things is that phrase, the Lord your God. But yeah, so there it is. Like, you don't need to appeal actually to, there's 20 different sources and they don't agree and they conflict and, we like lost half of it. I think if you look at the Hebrew, it actually just flows and makes sense. And don't get me wrong. Like, I actually really despise it when conservative interpreters of the scriptures just say, oh, those liberals in their, JEDP like source theories are all crazy, out to lunch. And it's like I actually engage with the arguments. And the thing is, what's good about him, like Dozeman, is he's actually noticing all these details that, frankly, a lot of conservative interpreters just don't even notice or understand. So at least he's trying to deal with it. But I don't think you have to end up necessarily agreeing with him if you just do some linguistics. So that's my take on it anyway. I see it, working out really nicely. And then, so what's the big takeaway, right? Like, well, you actually see, right, that, again, the people are not bad. Like, it's not like, God says, come up to the mountain. And they're like, okay, no, we're too scared. Oh, those people not going up to the mountain. Moses better talk some sense into them. We'll do everything. Here they go. No, like we turn them into cartoon characters with the way we misread this. But it's probably honestly because of a little bit of history of anti-Semitism. to be frank. But no, like this is us. This is God's people. These are our ancestors in the faith, being blessed by God and being moved by God to receive His word, and they receive it well. They receive it well, which is really supposed to be for our comfort, because all this tradition that we've been handed is not bad. It's not corrupted. It's not like they never understood to begin with. I mean, what a terrifying thought when you think about it, right? Like, so your whole tradition is based on something that was conveyed and transferred and handed down, that started with a bunch of people who didn't understand the original message. No. So I think this just affirms, like, actually, hey, no, look, God spoke these words, the people answered, and God saw that it was good. I mean, to kind of borrow some language of Genesis chapter 1, right? So you see a lot of good stuff here. The reception is good. The corruption comes in later, right? Just like Genesis, where everything's good in chapter 1 and chapter 2, and the corruption comes later in chapter 3, which just affirms the goodness of the covenant that God made. It's not like He did a bad legalistic thing with them, which I think is kind of what was partially responsible for all so much bad theology, which basically just pits the New Testament against the Old Testament. Like the Old Testament's some kind of like other angry, jealous, kind of like megalomaniacal God who is just like, obey all my rules or else. Like, and that's just not the picture at all. So it's important to understand the actual story, because the story is the theology. All right. Enough of that. Hopefully that clarifies chapter 19 and how that links up then with all this going up and down the mountain, and how that shows that it's Moses coming down from heaven is where it's foreshadowing, right? To give grace to God's people, and it is good. And that just is an amazing foreshadowing of Christ. So thanks, guys. If you do have any extra comments or questions, that'll take care of it, I think, for these little kind of bonus segments for a little while. But you can just post them directly on the on-demand video on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll try to respond when I have a chance. But got to get back to dissertation writing. So take care, everybody. Peace.